Migrating with Australia, the podcast where we confront all the issues about immigration coming to Australia, how great it is, how sometimes it's could be greater, but it's pretty bloody great. We're pretty bloody lucky to live here. Sorry for all the bloodies, but it's been that kind of bloody day. I can tell you what. Busy bloody morning, David. I'm Grant Williams. I just produce this show, and I'm always joined by Australia's favourite immigration lawyer, the man with the golden smile, Mr. David Boy. How are you this morning, David? Or it's afternoon.
This afternoon, it's 3:10, Grant. I'm very good. It's Saturday afternoon, and we have a great guest on the podcast this afternoon. And we'll soon. How many years before you finish your doctorate, Belle?
Hopefully 6 months from now.
Because I was going to say we've got Dr. Lim. So you're not Dr. Lim yet, but you're very close. You've got
candidate Belle Lim
in cancer genomics.
And current president of the Council for International Students Australia. And I'm really interested in Belle's position because David always forgets this, Belle. I used to be a student union president and I was pretty bolshy at the time. Pretty good. Sorry, Belle. Before David wraps you up and pumps up your tyres and we get right into it, David, I've had a query from somebody about an issue that we've spoken about a few times and I wanted to run it by you. This person is an RN in another country and has a partner in this country, and they've been exploring all the ways that she could come here, but the travel block has made it really difficult, and she had a refusal on a tourist visa a couple of years ago. So she's in a bit of a bind, but the idea of the bridging course so that she could upgrade her nursing qualifications and then find a job as an RN here has been floated. David, where are we with the bridging?
Has she spoken to the Australian Nursing Midwifery Assessment Council, ANMAC, Grant? Has she said anything there? She needs to reach out to AHPRA and Australian Nursing Midwifery Assessment Council and find out for concrete details because everything's up in the air at the moment.
And what do we have a timeline for when that stuff will happen?
ANMAC, if she rings AHPRA and ANMAC and asks them for further updates, they'll be able to tell her what is and what isn't happening.
Fantastic. Dispatched. Over to you, Mr. Bongiorno. Introduce Belle.
Oh, I'm dying to say Dr. Lim. Finishing in 6 months, cancer genomics, researching at Monash University and Peter MacCallum Hospital. Belle Lim, welcome to the Migrating to Australia podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
She's a very esteemed guest because she's not only doing a cancer genomics PhD, but she's also the president of the Australian Council of International Students of Australia. And that was one of the reasons we want to talk to you today about your PhD and student politics and the effect the COVID lockdown has had on international students here and international students abroad. So we might start with a brief background on you, Belle. You're how far into your doctorate?
So I am just over 3 years. So 3 years into my doctorate degree. And before that, I did a 4-year degree at Monash in pharmaceutical sciences. And before that, I did a year of pathway. So I came from Malaysia and went through the process like most international students would.
Pathway is a fantastic introduction to the Australian education system. And I've been thinking how wonderful it would be for Year 12 students to do a pathway. How well did that set you up for pharmaceutical and then your subsequent post degrees?
Pathway is an interesting choice for international students because in that setting, because if you go into year 12, for example, the good thing is that you are studying with the Australian peers, but the challenging thing is that you don't have that many international students peer, or you don't have a system that really understand the experience that we have. Coming to Australia is a big cultural transition that we have to go through, and there are a lot of questions that we have during that time. It is quite challenging for young people. I was 17 at that time, so it was quite challenging, and I do see the pathway having a really good experience for me to really understand the university system and Australian system, like you say.
Similar, I'm guessing, to Melbourne University's Trinity program. Are they the same idea?
Yes, very much the same.
So they're incredibly rigorous academically. I mean, could you almost say they're like a year 13?
Yes, year 12 or year 13.
How well did the program equip you? You said it raised some very interesting issues and was very helpful. What did it benefit, because a lot of international students or potential international students listen, what are some of the sort of practical tips you can give for those who are coming when they can come to pathway programs and want to do bachelor's and further postgraduate study? What are some of the tricks to adapt fast and adapt early?
First of all, one of the questions that I faced at that time was that, so I could either finish my high school, 6-year high school degree in Malaysia, and then I came here and applied for a bachelor's degree in Australia. But a lot of the questions that we face at that time is that when we apply for a university in Australia, is our grades going to be accepted, for example, because there are so many different systems in different countries, and within Malaysia there are different systems as well. I went through a private school, for example, so it was a lot easier for me to finish my last year of high school, or even for most people at 1 year of foundation studies here in Australia. And my tip would be that to think about what degree you want to go in, so what university degree you want to go in when you pick that foundation degree, because as you say, University of Melbourne has Trinity College, Monash University has their foundation, most universities have their own foundation program, and they really set you up to go into that university. And also, if you have an idea about what degree you want to go in, it's even better, because you get to choose the subjects that will really set you up for that success.
Now, you had wonderful FaceTime, class time. International students who are here may or may not be having class time. Most are online, and those who are overseas are online. Did you have any online study in your bachelor's or your doctorate?
No, because my doctorate is research-based, so we don't really have classes anyway. We do have webinars, but it's nowhere near as demanding as what the online classes would be for most international students. Because of my position at the council, we frequently speak to students and we know student sentiment, and I know how challenging a time it has been for students, especially those that are studying overseas. There's time zone difference, and there are so many challenges that even students in Australia that are doing online study will not have to navigate.
In the lab, you're performing research, so you have lots of FaceTime with supervisors and lots of FaceTime researching. By being online and having English as a second language for a lot of international students, what are they missing out on? It's a really important question, because I want students who are enrolling now and doing it offshore online to know what they're in for.
Yeah, that is a really good question. And I do think that this is something that education providers and agents and all of us, we need to be very frank and very honest with students about their expectations of enrolling to an online course. So I would say that since COVID happened last year, education providers have did a great job of transitioning very quickly online to keep the courses going. However, as expected, within that very short amount of time, the quality of online learning is not up to standard. And by standard, I don't mean standards according to the regulatory body. By standards, I mean standards that we have as consumers of this international education product. And frankly, as international students, we pay a lot for this education here in Australia. So we ran a survey recently for students that are studying offshore. We have received over 400 responses so far. Half of the students have never been to Australia. So I was a little bit surprised by the result, because for these students, if they haven't been to Australia and have face-to-face study, they don't really have a benchmark to compare to. But even so, they rated the satisfaction of online learning quite low. So they do have some grievances with the teaching quality and the learning experience that they have. The biggest problem with online learning is that what is distinctly Australian about Australian international education is studying with the Australian peer in an Australian setting. You don't get that in online learning. It is one thing if you enroll to this course knowing that it's going to be online. It's another thing if you enroll to this course thinking that you're going to come to Australia soon.
Belle, can I inject a couple of issues here? And David, this is something that I saw in some conversations online, and I wanted to know if this is actually happening. Somebody was in a discussion I was watching, had applied for acceptance at uni and had got it. What course I don't know. But at the same time, the education agent that they were using was shopping a student visa at the same time. And David, remember I messaged you during the week about $5,000 being for a course and visa. Now, I can't believe that when you can't come here, that there are people, and even the government should not be accepting the fees for a student visa if there's no prospect that you're going to be allowed to arrive here in July. Is that actually happening?
The other thing, before we give it over to Belle, the other thing that's really disturbing in that scenario is that very often education agents are in the employ of the university they've got the confirmation of enrolment from, and they'll take a percentage of the student fee, so they're double dipping. So they're taking a fee of $5,000, which is unconscionable for a student visa, a fee of $5,000, and they're taking commission off that student as well, which they probably don't declare, which is, again, unethical, unlawful. Belle, have you heard about...
Sorry, David, I just want to inject the other issue so that Belle can comment on the whole thing, if that's all right. What they were advertising too, David, was that the $5,000 was for their education plus the visa fees, which I thought was really odd. But the other thing, Belle, you talked about the disappointment and the standard being low. The other thing, which is totally unconscionable, is that while we've moved to this online learning, the universities have shed 50, 60,000 staff nationwide. So there's nobody for them to complain to or to get support from anymore. So there's nobody developing the courses. The courses are written and they're just delivered. And then how can you possibly have a quality experience on a Zoom call webinar with 200 eyeballs there? You put your hand up forever. You're never going to have any discussion. I mean, it's to our, in my opinion, it's to our great shame as a nation that these courses haven't been discounted. That's what should be being done, and we should be trying to ramp it up so that it's a superior offering instead of just everyone's race to the bottom. All the English as in UK courses, the American courses, the other South Africa are joining in. All these English language university courses have all become ordinary, and no one seems to want to deliver excellent education. But Belle, can you comment on people shopping around student visas? I mean, the education offering is one thing, but should anybody be paying the fees for a student visa for this year?
Well, 100%. So you have highlighted a couple of the main issues that we are advocating for. And with regards to tuition fee reduction, this is something that we've been calling for since last year. And we should have to be a campaign ambassador. In terms of education, you may know it's been an issue since very early on, because I think it really stems from the fact that international education in Australia have been treated less as an education and more of a commercial and trade with other countries. And with that, you have the erosion of ethics and moral obligation towards students. You see a lot of tactics and behaviors like this that are purely motivated by financial incentives. As you say, when education agents do that, it is unfair. It is absolutely unethical and unfair for students. On the issue of visa, it is a big problem and it is highly debatable. I see that in this space, there is a real clash between the role of the government and universities and education providers, because universities and education providers say that they have been hurting, and they have, because they, for example, the major universities group of 8, they have 30% of them are international students, and we pay a lot more fee than domestic students. So we have been funding a lot of the operation in universities. So without new students coming in, they are absolutely hurting. That is true. So they say that they don't have the capacity to provide tuition fee reduction or excellent education, as you say. They say that online learning and online teaching is more expensive than in-person teaching, and we don't doubt that. But this creates a problem for students who are the consumers, because it doesn't matter how much this transition costs. For students, we've paid the same amount of fee and we are not getting the quality product that we deserve, as you say. And the clash between the government and universities is students are suffering because of that, because no one is really taking responsibility to provide that kind of compassionate response for students who have been caught in the middle. And in Australia, I'm not sure about this in other countries, but in Australia, this is really eye-opening for me that the government and universities don't have a good relationship and they don't work together on this really important sector and issue that doesn't just have financial interest or economic benefit. It affects 700,000 international students in Australia. It is a real shame.
What's the 700,000? It's a staggering number. How many have stayed, Belle? Do you and your association have statistics, have contemporary numbers on who has stayed and who has gone home?
So we do check those statistics quite regularly from the Department of Home Affairs and Department of Education. So this year, as you would expect, enrollment has been down, and especially at the very start of the pathway, as we say, the foundation program, early course, the English language, for example, down 70% massively. For universities, it has been reduced, but not as bad, because people that have been enrolled, that have studied for the first year, they have to go to their second year, and the second year have to go to the third year. However, we do see that a lot of students are deferring. So the number has lowered to perhaps 650 or 600,000 is still a lot of students. And among them, 30% of them. So these are students that want to come back, but they couldn't.
Is the stress, the pain, the fact that they don't know when they can come? Or is it a combination of the way they've been treated in the process? Do they want to return?
Absolutely. Because why would anyone pay 40 grand a year for tuition fee if they are going to study on Zoom and on YouTube? We could have gotten that for much lower fee, frankly. Why would anyone enroll in an Australian institution? Unless it is advertised very frankly that this is a fully online course.
Has anyone gone to Sunway? Any of your friends and colleagues or juniors or seniors enrolled in Sunway as an alternative for those who come from Malaysia?
In fact, my sister did. So my sister was studying at Monash here. She made the decisions to go back home because she was living in the dorm by herself and it was just mentally not sustainable for her. She went home, and luckily we have a campus in Malaysia. So she was able to continue at Monash in Malaysia. However, she felt like she missed out a lot. She missed out a lot on the experience. She envisioned that she's going to third year in engineering. She envisioned she will have a lot of face-to-face interaction with her peers and other international students from different parts of the world here. Yeah, she was really upset about that. But I feel terrible for students who don't have any face-to-face learning opportunity, especially in the courses where there are practical components that just cannot be replicated online.
Belle, what are the challenges for those students who have remained here and were sort of stuck here in that horrible time where their work disappeared and the unis hadn't really got their act together with delivery of the courses? And as you mentioned, a whole lot of the accommodation options disappeared for people as well. So we know how hard it was in 2020, but how are the international students who are still living in Australia coping with their access to their courses, to their supervisors, to libraries, to accommodation and employment?
So last year has been really hard for students, as you say, that students are the first ones and temporary residents are the first ones to lose our jobs. A lot of students fell into hardship because, as opposed to some of the stereotypes, most international students rely on part-time income to sustain ourselves here in Australia. Australia is a very expensive country to live in. especially for us whose parents or our savings are built on currency from other countries. And that was just such a dark time for students, first of all, facing financial problems. And most students felt the stress. A lot of them are skipping meals, have trouble with finding a space to live. And I think emotionally, it was terrible hearing what the Australian politicians and leaders are saying, absolutely non-compassionate. And for students who have invested a lot in our education, and indeed in this country, it was just really shocking. So I think that this year, we're lucky that Australia is doing a lot better with the pandemic and opening up. Most students have found some sort of income. So we haven't heard mass issues like last year, but the problem that we have is the proportion of students who rely on their parents' savings or their parents to pay their tuition fee, which is actually a lot of students whose parents have lost their income. These are students that have nowhere to go. You cannot make up 40 grand a year working part-time here in Australia at a service station. So these students are facing cancellation of their COE and cancellation of their visa halfway through their study. So we are really concerned about that.
Belle, have the schools, the universities, colleges dipped into their deep pockets and offered, there's no fee reductions for courses online, but have they put up cash loans, cash grants to help students in this scenario? Have the schools given money, given food packages? Have the schools played a part in helping their clients, their customers?
This varies greatly just from school to schools. And I would say that so far, because we've been surveying which universities have offered tuition fee reduction, for example, there are a few that have offered tuition fee reduction for online studies up to 20%, I think is the most. But a lot of universities haven't. And with regards to cash loans, for example, we rarely hear about any of that. We are definitely advocating for that because students absolutely do deserve those kind of help. But yeah, it's really different from institution to institution. And I would say that over the past year, certain state governments, for example, Victoria and New South Wales, have put in some funding to help students in hardship. Victoria committed 50 million in total, I believe. And that did go to students that are really in need. The extent is not enough because it is not continual support like what JobKeeper does for Australians. $1,000 of $2,000 one-off doesn't even pay our rent for long. So it was still hard, and that go towards universities as well. Certain universities and most universities, in fact, have offered some sort of hardship support for students. Yeah, as I said, the extent was not enough, but it was appreciated at that time.
Belle, you mentioned that it was very hurtful for a lot of internationals and temporary residents to hear the message from the government that was essentially get out or look after yourself. What I'm wondering is how do those students feel about the wider community now? Has the relationship between Australia and our visiting students been irreparably damaged, do you think?
That was a really good question. Honestly, those kind of comments was a punch in our gut because we pay taxes. When we work, we pay taxes. We've paid so much tuition fee as everyone knows. And we volunteer in our community. We volunteer in the city festivals. We volunteer in soup kitchen. When we pay taxes, we tick the box of Australian resident for tax purposes. But when it comes to when we're in trouble, we are all of a sudden not part of the community or as valued as the community. It was very hurtful. And I think that for the Australian community is quite heterogeneous. We do have community support such as the food bank and certain community organizations that step up during that time to fill that role that the government really should have done and provided those care for students. However, actually the leadership, the political leadership in a country have significant influence over the people in the country. So we've also seen people being enabled to be outwardly racist or xenophobic. And I think that has been repaired. I don't know how long it will take for it to be repaired. And especially now students look over across the ocean at other countries like the UK, Canada, or even the US now. The US is providing, as David might know, some visa flexibility for students and PR pathway for students that are going to help them rebuild their economy. And Australia is host so many international students who have valuable skills, students that are trained in this country. And we don't see Australia value students as much as the other countries. And this comparison is glaringly obvious for students.
David, the third, fourth, or fifth biggest industry export earner, depending on how you calculate it. And we have been monumentally stupid. And so what I'm worried about, Belle, is that do you think that the students who perhaps have had to go home, like your sister, will ever look favourably on Australia as an option for study again?
Yes, that is a good question. And with regards to, I think, the government's response, while we understand that it is a very difficult decision for them to make with regards to border because of Australia's handling with the pandemic, the messages could have been so much better, and the tone of the message could have been so much better. It conveyed a lot about how you view students. And I do think that this is an alarm that I've been sounding to the government and stakeholders for a while. From Malaysia, I know that there are a number of political and business leaders that were educated in Australia, and they spoke about Australia very favorably. And you could see the soft diplomacy and the soft power that Australia has in the region, in the Asia Pacific region in particular, because of so many students that have lived here. When you've lived in a different country for a few years, you form a connection with the country, and it's not just one-time visiting. Or even visiting, you form that connection. Students that have lived here for a few years, they have this connection with Australia. And when they go back to their country or our country, a proportion of these students will become leaders in the sector, in different sectors and different countries. And this is where I do see that for students that have been treated badly or neglected, they will not. We have seen many commentary from students that say that they really regret ever choosing Australia. They wish they'd chosen other country. And this will not be repaired until Australia really make a big action on that. And we haven't seen that after a year now.
A lot of people fail to understand how important international students are. Some of them locally understand how important they become as permanent residents and citizens when they're doctors, dentists, lawyers, high-end IT, social workers, captains of industry, etc. Can you just explain to listeners how important international students are as international students, not just because they bring feeds to the economy, intense intellect and hunger to the economy, but they're also instrumental in such sectors. I mean, their existence is a source of great income, accommodation, retail, tourism. And can you just take listeners through the wonderful and important utility of an international student at the start? Because I think a lot of them understand once they become Australian permanent residents and Australian citizens, they're incredible givers to the community. But like what you were saying before, you guys give from the word go. You give, you volunteer, you serve, you do work that Australian people don't want to do because they're too lazy or too scared to do it. And Grant and I, we talk often, our favourite migrants, and you agree with me, Grant, international students and business investors are the most important migrants for Australia.
Look, what people don't understand is that an international student who catches the train from Carnegie and then gets off at Flinders Street or Melbourne Central and walks up to RMIT or to Melbourne Uni, one of the other city-based campuses, they buy a coffee, they buy their noodles or rice and some chicken curry or something on the way. They buy a newspaper. They stop off at the bookshop and buy a novel to read on the train on the way home. So we've already got to the point of spending $30 on that trip, or $40, and then they're paying their $1,000 a week in rent to a private landlord, and they're putting their money in the coin laundry to do their washing once a week. Apart from the value of the university fees, which is what everybody always talks about, that's 700,000 people in the community turning over cash money in local businesses. And the reason that so many places in Australia have not bounced back the way people were expecting is not because the tourists are not coming. It's because, as you just said, Belle, earlier, that 30% of the international student market who would normally be here spending $30 a day and their rent are not here.
Yes, indeed. Everyone knows the economical value of the sector, 40 billion a year in 2019. That's the figures that we throw around all the time. And I have been thinking about why, given that this is the largest service export industry in Victoria and the third largest, as you say, Australia, why isn't it valued by the Australian community as much smaller industry have been for their economical contribution? And I think it is a very complicated question. I think, first of all, a lot of people don't realize how they personally have been impacted. They don't feel like they've seen that money. $40 billion, it goes to university. We haven't seen that money. But as Grant, you laid out, most people have, small businesses have, and it goes towards your local government, and it goes towards, it completely affects your life. One thing that people also don't see, and they wrongly say that international students are here to steal their job. It is absolutely.
People who say that so lost in the past, but it takes so long to shake these kind of prejudices that are held because you're brought up with them. And
Yes.
Like David and Belle, I don't know did you see the example of one of the local RSL guys a week or so back who was giving a talk at a school? It was in Queensland somewhere. It was in a rural area. And David, this is the entrenched thing. I don't think the guy was a racist, right? He's an ex-serviceman. He's served the country, but he's older than David and I. So he's been brought up with all the 60s and 70s kind of messages that kids got. And he talked to the kids about why Anzac was so important, and he referred to the yellow peril about Australia entering Vietnam. Now, he had no idea that the terminology to little kids is wrong. You can talk about the historical battle of the Cold War and whatnot, but we don't talk about our friends and neighbours and the grandparents of those children who were sitting in the class who looked more like you, Belle, than they looked like me. You can't say the yellow peril. And so many people don't get it anymore. I mean, it's going to take another generation to shake it out, I think.
It is going to take time, and I think that we just need to actively push back and move forward, progress forward. And with regards to taking jobs, in fact, international students form essential part of workforce. You've seen that the hospitality industry is struggling. They don't have enough workers. They are open up, even though the lockdown has been lifted. They are not able to operate as well as they used to previously because they don't have the workforce. And you've seen the agriculture industry that made a big splash a few months ago. Lots of the produce went rotten because no one's going to pick it. Who used to pick it? International students and temporary migrants. So we're just very undervalued.
David?
Aged care is another sector that international students and temporary residents shine in and do things that Australians don't want to do or refusing to do or can't do. And we're big fans of international students on this program. Sorry, Grant, you were going to say?
What I was going to say, it follows on from Belle's point, is that the other economic impact that people haven't factored in, and David, you run a business, and I know you've had staff turnover in the last 2 years. It costs a lot of money to train someone to do the job of somebody who is sitting offshore, who used to work for you, who isn't allowed back in to do the job that you still want them to do. It's been insane.
Yes.
And the amount of what I don't understand with the government, and perhaps you can tell us a bit more about how the government listens to you, Belle, and the organisation. But the government just announced that it was going to spend money subsidising, basically just giving a handout to help the owners of private colleges who offer generally vocational-based training. They're going to give them money so they don't lose their houses because their businesses are going broke. Okay, I understand that. Wouldn't it have been better to have organised a quarantine system where we could have brought the international students back and we could have subsidised that side of the industry, and it would have just kept going and they would have received the money that they're going to get from the government now anyway? It's so bloody dumb.
I don't have answer to that because I am along the same lines of thinking. And going back to the workforce thing, I've listed a few examples that are more manual labor, for example. But may I also add that international student graduates that were trained in Australia are highly talented, and they automatically bring with them the global experience, the cultural understanding from a different country. And when they receive, or when we receive our 2-year to 4-year post-study work visa, what do a lot of these students do? They are not working in the field where they can use their talent and the Australian skills. So this is a massive missed opportunity there. And the third area of students' contribution that I want to add very importantly is the cultural value to this country. Australia have benefited so much from being a multicultural country. And if you think about the experience, the classroom experience for domestic students, if there's no international students, as they are now, I sometimes were shocked by how little their understanding is for the world or the rest of the country or the non-Western part of the country. Can you imagine how the classroom experience would be for domestic students who went to university, who went to higher degree and not have that understanding? So this is not to say that in a multicultural society or in a classroom with people from different cultures, it's going to be easy, because it is not easy. You need to have structure in place to improve everyone's cultural understanding and diversity and everything. But we do see that international students are just very undervalued, and a lot of, may I say, more conservative Australians would rather not have that. And I think they don't know what they would miss.
A lot of Australians also fail to understand that many international students are studying at tertiary level in a second or third language.
Indeed.
And Belle, I'm just waiting. I want to jump in a time machine and go maybe 7 years ahead and then listen to state and federal government representatives who are saying, I don't understand why we're losing our share, our market share of exports to Malaysia and India and Vietnam. I just can't understand why that is. And it's totally because of the soft power issue, the influence that you have now. If you kick the graduates in the teeth now, when they're middle managers in a wine importing company in 5, 7, 10 years' time, and they've got to make a choice between Chilean wine, South African wine, or Australian wine, they're not giving any positive benefit to Australia. Chile's in with a chance. These guys are dumb, and they look. It makes me so angry.
There's reports, Belle, in the press that they're looking finally to introduce a separate quarantine stream in Victoria, at least, to bring international students back in limited numbers, subject to success of those who come before them, and hopefully that might gather a head of steam, and we might see international students come back on a larger and more frequent basis if those who arrive first do get through the program without the state stuffing it up. Do you think Victoria will get the capacity, be given the power, the permission to bring international students in? And if they are allowed to bring them in, Where are they going to come from?
David, I have a lot to say on this topic. So have been stuck offshore, and honestly, it was heartbreaking. A lot of students that we surveyed or spoke to, they were confident at the very start that Australia is gonna have a plan to bring us back because we've lived here for a few years. Australia is gonna bring us back, and they were absolutely shattered by the fact that they were kept out and those messages that came out. So since November and a little bit before that, the Commonwealth government put out a protocol. So the protocol is for each state and territories to develop their own pilot plan, develop their own plan to bring students back with quarantine system and everything. They have their conditions there. But since July last year, we know that NT, the Northern Territory, went through this process, successfully brought in 63 international students. And since then, Adelaide was going to have the second flight. It was scrapped because the small outbreak happened. And then since then, there hasn't been any plans that were submitted to the Commonwealth government for approval. So from the Commonwealth government point of view, they kept saying that they have not received any plan that they can consider. So I question the whole process, how effective it is that you have a protocol in place, that it is not moving forward since July last year. So we do know that New South Wales and Victoria are making plans, and this is not the fault of the sector. The sector has been really active in developing these plans because they need students to come back. But at some point, nothing is being done there, and it is very complicated, perhaps for me as an outsider. But I do see the lack of Commonwealth government leadership in this. You don't see federal leadership in this. Why are individual states and territories making their own plans without best practice? And with the state-to-state, domestic, political climate consideration and all of that, who is going to make the first move to put this forward? Why hasn't they put it forward? This is all beyond me. But I do see that this whole process is just not effective. And with regards to the Victorian proposal, it hasn't been approved by the Commonwealth government yet. So we don't know how it's going to go. Even if it did miraculously move forward and it happened, it is 120 per week or per fortnight of economic travelers. And how many of that will go to international students? How long will it take to bring back the 40,000 students that are still offshore? And may I just add that since last year, 300,000 Australians have returned from overseas, and they could not find places for international students.
And Belle, I don't know if David wants to go on to this territory, but the federal government this week laughed at another suggestion for Victoria to have a non-hotel system of quarantine. They have refused to use the options that are available to them. And as you said, that quota that Victoria wants to expand, that's going to be full of sports people, famous celebrities, people who are like movie producers and things like that, and just your normal business travelers who are trying to do deals in agriculture and all the other sort of mainstream industries. So sadly, I think we're only going to get 20, 30, 40 internationals a week, which is not going to sustain anything. I think you're right. I don't think that the federal government is serious. And you present cases to them and information to them. I wonder do you think they have any conception of how big the problem is and how long-lasting the repercussions could be? Do you think they're listening and taking the presentations you give to them seriously?
This is also a question that we have. From our perspective, it is our job, for me, to represent international students in Australia, and for the sector, for other people in the sector to represent their sector. It is our job to keep telling them how serious this problem is. I believe that the people that sit in the parliament and sitting in their offices are smart people. So it might be something that they weigh up and they decide that this is something that they're going to sacrifice. So it is really difficult for us to hear because there are real people on the other side that has been impacted. And these people, us international students, we are not super privileged. We are not super have the ability to withstand losing our education, losing money that we paid for our education. And it is really heartbreaking. And I don't know if they fully understand the extent of the problem, but I think that they do. They are just not making an action towards that. This is a little bit sad to say. And also, there's competition to other countries. If you've seen the recent report that came out, the UN and Canada came out on the top. Students are going there, prospective students are going there, current students in Australia are trying to get there because there's no chance for them to come back until next year. Even the US has a big bounce back since last year. So I don't know how much market share Australia is going to have after this year. And for students that are stuck overseas, the hardest thing for them is perhaps the uncertainty. They've been waiting since last year. The government kept saying 2021. In April 2020, you think 2021 is so long. I couldn't possibly wait for so long. They did wait. And now at 2021, they're saying maybe 2022. For these students, the uncertainty is just unbearable.
Perhaps, Belle, you could take some of these decision makers on a walk through QV on a Saturday afternoon and then show them what QV was like 2 years ago and what QV is like today. The life of Melbourne, I haven't been to Sydney recently, the life of Melbourne's been ripped out of it by the absence of international students. The city is now soulless and not a nice place to be. That's another thing. You guys, as international students, bring a vitality. You make Melbourne a 24-hour city. We've gone backwards decades in the absence of international students.
Yes, indeed. And one thing that I also want to add, why we felt like international students have been unfairly treated, or you see the perhaps disproportionate response towards India versus the US, how much of that, I question, has been driven by the unchecked and unconscious or subconscious phobia.
Belle, I can say this. I know David won't want to. Somebody posed the question in Twitter, what's different between India and then Brazil, Canada, US, South Africa? And my answer that I put out in public is very simple. White people.
Yeah.
You've got a position of tremendous responsibility and a position of tremendous power, and I think you're a fantastic spokesperson for the body. What I'm wondering is, how have you been able to be so effective but also do PhD studies in cancer genomics? Do you have 48 hours in your day?
David, I think that it has been a struggle for me and the council because our council, we do have very high visibility and sits on the Council for International Education that's chaired by Education Minister, for example. But we are run by 11, at most 11 full-time international students, volunteers. This is a voluntary role, but we understand, as you say, how much students need a representation. We try to do the best that we can, and it's definitely not easy for me, and also the mental stress and weight around that. But I think it really drives me, the purpose behind the work, and I just try to do my best from one day, every day.
You've gone through uninterrupted from pathway bachelor's through, so you've been here how many years in total?
8 years, I believe, since 2013. So it's been a while.
And you've studied since 2013 without break?
Yes.
Wow, fantastic. We tip our hats to you. The story for you after you finish your PhD, are you going to do a 485 or are you going to go back to Malaysia? What are your migration plans?
So personally, I'm open to opportunities. At the moment, for me, in this field of study, Australia is definitely a better choice for me. A lot of doctorate students, after they finish, they would pursue postdoctoral opportunities overseas. But because of COVID, I don't think that America or Europe would be an option for me. I wouldn't really want to travel during this climate. And I know that I'm an international student. I might not be able to come back. So personally, I would be here for a few years.
Would you ever look to take permanent residency?
I think if there is an option, that will be great for my personal, career and life planning.
Peter MacCallum I've helped a number of doctors from Peter MacCallum get visas over the years, and it's an incredibly important institute in this country, not just this city. How is the funding going at Peter MacCallum? Is it a constant battle for funding, or is it funding a lot more established and frequent now?
Funding for research, it is harder and harder each year. I think, there's not much. The pool of money is quite static every year, and there are a lot of talented researchers just in this Parkville precinct here in Victoria. So it is still quite difficult to get funding. It is very competitive. It is an incredible place to do research. So as you said, it really is. So I feel very lucky to be working and be trained by this group of researchers. But I am not sure about how easy it would be for me to stay in research because of the funding issue.
Do you come from a family of scientists?
No, interestingly, my mom finished high school, but she hasn't had a professional work because she married young. And my dad didn't finish junior high school. He dropped out of school at 14. So he really is a self-made person for his family. And I'm very grateful for my father. And he gave me a life that he couldn't have imagined for himself. But at the same time, it is a bit of a struggle. This veers a little bit from migration and all of that talk. But my parents wasn't super supportive at the start when I said I want to pursue a PhD, because they would rather me get married, as women at my age should be doing in my culture. But I think that they are proud of me now.
I think they should be very proud. Absolutely. They would be. Do you have brothers and sisters here in Australia as well studying?
Yes, I do have one brother in year 12 actually, this year.
He's got a big sister who's achieved incredible academic feats. I guess he'd be too scared to go into science now that you're about to finish with a doctorate. What does he want to do when he finishes?
Lucky, he's completely opposite to me, and he's very talented. He's an artist and he wants to pursue art.
David, Belle is an example of why the talk of people saying students are here to take our jobs. Just have a look at the impact that just financially that Belle and her family
absolutely
have had in Australia. And it's, apart from all the cultural things, the friendships, all that stuff, Belle is doing highly specialist work. Belle, you don't know, but David does. The kind of work that is done at Peter MacCallum is really important for me personally, and for hundreds of thousands of Australians all the time. I just get so frustrated. And Belle, the fact that you can you're paying the sort of fees that you are, you're doing the kind of academic work that you're doing.
And volunteering
And working part-time, and you're limited by our rules, by how much you can work. People just, the general community and the ones that the government are playing to, because that's the electoral thing, the marginal seat people don't know. The people in the safe city seats who have lots of contact with you, or in the rural university towns, they know. But the young families buying their first house, they don't get it, and that's why the government isn't responsive. It's dumb.
So we thank podcasts like yours that really share those information and this truth out and against some of the myth. And as you say, this is what I really want to say to a lot of students. We should know what our value is. So on the question about permanent residency, no, I'm not stressed about that, because I know that wherever I go, I'm going to make a contribution to the community and the society. It's up to Australia, whether Australia and the system recognize many talent like myself.
It'd be devastating, Belle, if they didn't recognise your talent. It would be our loss, a huge loss if you didn't. The story is your term finishes as president of the body. When do you finish your term?
So around July or August this year.
So who has the very scary job of filling your shoes, because you're magnificent, and I can't tell you how much Grant and I have got out of this podcast. This has been a pleasure for us to hear and to help and advocate, because you are an outstanding ambassador for international students, an outstanding ambassador.
Thank you so much. It's been a really lovely chat. We don't know who that person would be yet. We will go through that election, but I believe that anyone who come into this role will recognize how important the work is, and we always do the best that we can.
We love international students.
We do.
And I think I mentioned to you before we started, I was once a student union president and was in a whole lot of forums and councils with the international representatives. And usually the smartest people in the room were not the ones with the loudest voices and the whitest skin. That's all I can.
Gospel truth. Belle, my final question to you, would you do it all again, given what's happened?
I'll get into this role.
The whole adventure, the whole Australian adventure. If you could wind back the time clock to 2013, would you do it again?
100% or 200%. My experience has been incredible. I know that in this podcast, we highlighted the current issues that have been really disheartening. And I have to say that there have been challenging times, because sometimes the community isn't as compassionate about what we have to go through. I personally have been through racism on a daily basis, like most international students and people of color do. There are challenging parts of that. There are also so many highlights since I came to Australia. One thing is that people treat me with people also treat me with a lot of respect, given or not fall into kind of the gender stereotype. And in my family or culture, my personal background, this is something that I struggle with a little. So there are certainly good sides to my personal experience. And this is why international students want to come to study in Australia, because there is a cultural difference and there are good things that we learn. And when we go back to our country, we bring that to our country. So this influence that Australia has can be really big. So yeah, personally, I would definitely do it all over again. I can't speak for students that have had worse experience that I have over the past 12 months.
Sorry, David, I can never just have one last question. I've got two last questions for you, Belle. And the first one is, and I'll string them together for you. You've been here long enough for it to be a pretty substantial chunk of time, about half of a generation. In that time, have you seen Australia's attitude to international students just within the community improve? Because you mentioned you've had some pretty ordinary daily occurrences. And the second part of the question is, what is your message to an international student, to somebody thinking about becoming an international student in Australia, perhaps maybe not next semester, but maybe the one after or the one after that? What would you say to them?
Grant, the first question, unfortunately, I don't think that the view on international students has gotten better because of how the, let's say, cultural phenomenon that is America's last president, the influence that he had on the conversation towards migrants, and more recently to Asian people, it has detrimental impact on the public discourse and conversation and sentiment around that. So I don't think that it has gotten better, but I do say that we have more responses to those kind of things. For example, we have people coming together to fight against those kind of old school mentality, as you say. So I am optimistic about the future. I don't think it's going to come easily. We'll have to put up a fight, but I think it will get better, as it always does when a lot of people come together to make changes. To your second question, what would I say to international students? I would say that I do think that Australia is a great place to come. In general, Australians are very friendly, like the both of you are very friendly and open-minded, even for people that have deep views. There are ways that you can prove yourself and change their views, even though the burden shouldn't be on international students to do that, our opportunity to do that. One thing, though, that a lot of students would find difficult is that the cultural difference. Back in our home country, we are a lot more reserved and shy and less confident in our expression. This is something that I think students do have some disadvantage about when you're in classes and when you're speaking to an Australian. I would say to a lot of students, just believe in what you can bring, believe in yourself, and believe that what you say, value what you feel is important, and don't don't take a lot of the shit that people might give you.
Param said you do some extraordinary work, and I'm going to give Param a call after and thank him for introducing us, because you've been extraordinary. And if you ever tire of the lab, would you ever turn your hat to politics?
David, I don't think that I am eligible to run for public office here in Australia, with the exception of Melbourne, perhaps.
Because you're a great spokesperson and you're a fabulous ambassador for international students. You embody all that is good. And I can't thank you enough for coming on our podcast this afternoon, Belle. Thank you very much.
But I also want to say that Australian politics as it is now is not a good place for women. So let's fix that first.
Belle, what's the website that international students should be looking towards if they need some assistance or some advocacy or anything else that you can provide?
They can go to our website at cisa.edu.au. We have some information on the website. And there is a complaint portal if they want to put in their thoughts. We are not able to service individual cases, but we do gather those opinions and sentiments because they are available to inform our advocacy directions.
David, this has been one of the most important conversations I think we've had on the podcast.
100%.
And Belle, it highlights the positives of a long-form podcast, a long-form format, rather than trying to fit into a 5-minute grab on an ABC Drive program or something like that. So we will certainly be pushing out the opinions in the show as far as wide as we can. It's a really vital national interest issue for this country, in my opinion. And thanks for coming on and being a part of it.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been very fun.
Great.
Have a great afternoon, Belle. Good luck with the rest of the 6 months.
Thank you. I will keep you updated.
Please do. Ciao.
And David, is there any final words you want to give the podcast audience before we sign off?
I don't think words could do justice to our guests or anything. Everything pales in comparison to Belle. We've just had one of the most important guests, as you said, on the program, and news about the May 11 budget and the July budget we can talk about next program. There's not much to say after Belle. She's covered it all, and she's covered it magnificently.
I want to point out one thing about the proportion of people in Australia. Electoral politics has become pretty poisonous, and Belle made the point that the Trumpist agenda, even though it's on the other side of the world, that ignoramus, right-wing, fundamentalist, revisionist bullshit has infected the political discussion here. But we once had a politician who was a prime minister who was a woman who proudly said to the internationals that you have a friend in Australia. Simple message.